The Senate takes its first step toward more financial regulation with a test vote of Senator Chris Dodd's bill on Monday. But our next guest says the last thing we need is more regulation. Joining us now from Stamford, Connecticut, Peter Schiff, President and Chief Global Strategist at Euro Pacific Capital, author of the new book, How an Economy Grows. He also happens to be running for that Senate seat that will be vacated by the aforementioned Senator Chris Dodd. So now that we got the 40-word intro out of the way, Peter, let's get right into this. Why don't we need this, right? Even the bankers on Wall Street think, well, maybe it's not too bad.
Well, don't listen to those bankers. You know, they were part of the problem. And, of course, the last thing we need is more regulation, especially crafted by Chris Dodd, who was one of the architects of the housing bubble in the first place. Look, we got into this mess because of an excess of government regulation, because of artificially low interest rates by the Federal Reserve, because of the moral hazards created by Fannie and Freddie. And this regulation does nothing to address those underlying problems. The Fed is actually given more power instead of having power taken away from it. Freddie and Fannie that are doing even more damage now, insuring even more mortgages now than they were before, they are untouched by this. All this is window dressing. It's going to do nothing to prevent the next economic crisis. In fact, had this bill existed in its entirety 4 or 5 years ago, we still would have had the problem.
That is a great point. We've talked about it a little bit, but go into more on Fannie and Freddie, Peter. Listen, they're huge, and yet, as you said, this thing doesn't touch them. Nobody seems to touch them. Nobody in Congress seems to want to talk about them. You know, Jim Chanos the other day on the show said basically Fannie and Freddie were insolvent. Where do we go with these massive institutions?
Well, remember, you can either have free market regulation or government regulation. I prefer free market regulation, but you have to have some regulation. And when it comes to Freddie and Fannie, since the government basically guarantees all their debts, they removed all the free market regulation. Nobody cares how risky their portfolio is. Everybody knows that they're good for their debts no matter what they do because the government stands behind them. Therefore, here is a case where we need government regulation to undo the damage of the moral hazard of the government subsidy. But they do nothing. You know, we've done nothing. Interest rates are lower now than they were when they inflated the bubble. The Fed is doing more damage to our economy than they were doing before, and we're rewarding them with more power, and the more power they have, the more damage they're going to have. Meantime, this financial regulation, I'm sure it's going to impact little firms like mine, Euro Pacific Capital. It's going to cost me more money, not because I'm doing anything wrong, but now I'm going to have to spend even more money to comply with worthless rules and regulations that are going to be written in pursuant to this bill. It's going to run up my costs. Maybe I can survive. Hopefully I can stay in business. But smaller firms might go under.
Yeah.
This is all music to the ears of these too big to fail firms because higher regulatory costs are unfairly borne by the smaller firms that don't have the economies of scale to absorb them.
There are many, though, who will say, and they can make strong points, that free market regulation is an oxymoron, Peter.
No, it isn't.
Sarbanes-Oxley passed in 2002, which was designed to prevent fraud, right? You know, what's that done?
Well,
and
remember,
the free market hasn't worked.
Remember, government regulations, government laws normally achieve the opposite effect of their stated purpose. And again, I'm sure this is going to be the case, but market regulation works great. Remember, there's fear and greed. What prevents me from lending money to somebody is the fear that I might not get paid back. And because I'm worried about that, then I do my due diligence. I make sure that the borrower can pay me back. But when the government comes in and says, don't worry about the losses, we've got you covered, we're going to guarantee it, that's when the free market doesn't work because the government comes in there. Or when you have a Greenspan put, when you have Wall Street thinking that no matter what goes wrong, the government's going to bail them out. And this bill actually makes that moral hazard worse. And of course, when the government is subsidizing debt and encouraging debt by keeping interest rates so low, by making borrowing so enticing, a lot of people get lured into the trap. But the government set the trap, not the free market.
But something's going to happen, right? Do you think there's any way it's going to not happen?
Well, I think this bill is going to pass, unfortunately. I mean, count on Congress to always do the wrong thing, especially when they design these Goldman Sachs charges to coincide with the debate on this bill. I mean, I'm not so naive not to recognize how the government timed this. They had this information on Goldman Sachs for a long time. It was very strategic when they sought to release it because I think it's creating a bigger
Do you think Goldman is guilty?
I don't know if they're guilty or not. I mean, obviously, You know, I know about these securities. I mean, we bet against these securities ourselves for some of the clients at Euro Pacific Capital, but we had no involvement in creating them. We simply thought that they would fail. Now, here's the problem. If Goldman Sachs, with John Paulson, devised these securities so that they would have the worst possible mortgages, the most likely to default, the real ticking time bombs, the zero down, ninja loans, you know, if they picked them in, you know, in Vegas, in Florida, you know, if they tried to make it so it would be the worst, and then when they went and marketed it, they told the buyers that there was a different criteria, that these bonds were chosen because they were good credit quality, because they represented a good buying opportunity. If they mismarketed the securities, then it's fraud, and it's already illegal. We don't need these new rules. But I don't know what these investors were told. I mean, they were very sophisticated. I mean, from my perspective, I don't know how anybody could have been dumb enough to buy these securities.
We'll leave it there because I can't say any better. Peter Schiff, Euro Pacific Capital, and author of the new book, How an Economy Grows. Peter, thank you very much.
And why it crashes.
Fair enough. That's the
Don't
second.
forget
That's
that.
the second half. There you go. All right,
That's where we are right now.
That is true, and we'll have you back on again soon. We'll talk more about it and how we finally grow. All right, take care.
Thank you.